They broke her ribs. They broke her hands. They dragged her into the dungeon so deep the sun forgot it existed. And when the iron doors opened for her execution, Attila wasn't praying anymore. She was counting names. She knelt where they had thrown her, the chains around her wrists pulled so tight they made her shoulders tremble. The stone beneath her was cold and damp, darkened by the blood that had seeped from her torn skin and soaked into the cracks. Every breath scraped through her chest like glass, but she refused to let it show. Pain was a language she'd already mastered. Her face was hollow now, eyes sunken from nights without sleep, from weeks of being erased one strike at a time. But behind that emptiness burned something that hadn't gone out. Hatred didn't need strength. It lived on memory. The iron doors groaned open. Boots thundered across the dungeon floor. For figures poured in from the corridor, hoods pulled low, blades already lifted as if they couldn't wait. Light flared through the ceiling grates, tearing the darkness apart in white, violent streaks. Dust leapt into the air, swirling like ash around them. Attila didn't look away. She raised her head just enough to meet the first man's eyes. There was no fear left to give them, only the slow, steady promise of what she would remember if she somehow lived long enough to remember anything at all. Then she heard it, a sound too small for a place like this. A whimper. It slipped through the dungeon like a crack in the world, thin and trembling, and it didn't belong here. The assassins faltered for half a breath, confused. Attila turned her head, every movement sending fire through her body, and saw the cage on the far wall shaking. Two tiny shapes pushed through the bent iron bars. Paws scrabbled uselessly on the stone. One stumbled, the other bumped into it, and then they were free, scrambling across the floor on legs that barely seemed strong enough to carry them. Wolf pups, no bigger than her forearm. Their eyes wide, their bodies shaking, their cries sharp with terror. They didn't hesitate. They ran straight to her. One slammed into her chest, burying its face in the torn fabric of her shirt. The other tangled itself in the chain at her wrist, squealing, refusing to let go even when the cold iron cut into its tiny paws. Their warmth pressed into her like something she'd forgotten existed. Attila froze. For a single moment, the dungeon went silent except for their frantic breathing. Then the assassins moved again. One laughed under his hood, a short, ugly sound. Another raised his blade higher. Firelight flickered across their faces, turning them into monsters stitched from shadow and cruelty. Something broke open inside Attila. Not like pain, not like grief, but like the last locked door in a room she'd been sealed into for too long. She bent over the pups, chains rattling as she wrapped her body around them, curling herself into a shield even though she knew how useless flesh was against steel. The smaller pup crawled up her shoulder, tiny claws hooking in her collar, pressing its face against her neck as if she were the only safe place left in the world. Her breath came out uneven. Her jaw shook. And then, through broken teeth and blood-slick lips, she whispered it. Not to the men, not to the gods who had never come, but to the part of herself that was still alive. If I walk out alive, she said, voice raw and low, I will kill every one of you. The words didn't echo. They sank into the stone, into the chains, into the terrified little bodies shaking against her heart. The assassins were only a few steps away now, but Attila no longer saw them as the end. She saw them as the beginning. The chains didn't hurt anymore. That terrified her more than the blood drying in her hair, more than the broken ribs grinding together every time she breathed. Pain had a voice. It screamed. It begged. It demanded mercy. And hers had gone silent days ago. Now there was only heat. Not warmth, heat. A furious, burning pressure coiled behind her eyes, in her chest, in the hollow place where hope used to live. It stayed with her through the long hours when the dungeon swallowed time and the guards forgot she existed. It stayed when they tore at her hands until she couldn't feel her fingers. It stayed when they left her chained in her own filth, promising they'd come back later to finish what they started. This was what Julius had made of her. He hadn't needed to raise a weapon. He'd destroyed her with ink and lies, with a single parchment pressed into the emperor's hand at dawn. treason, espionage, conspiracy. Words written so neatly they looked harmless. He'd stood beside her while the order was read, his voice steady, his eyes full of false regret. She had been screaming inside her own skull while soldiers wrapped iron around her wrists. She had trusted him. The memory was like acid. She saw it every time she closed her eyes. Julius leaning closer across the council table, lowering his voice as if they were still allies. You were never meant to find that kennel, Attila. As if discovering the murdered mother of the royal heirs had been her mistake. As if she were the danger for wanting the truth. He visited her once in the dungeon. Just once. He crouched outside the bars and told her how fragile reputations were. How easily they crumbled. He said the wolves would be raised better without her interference. Then he left her there to rot. So she did. She rotted in the dark while her bones healed crooked and her skin learned the shape of iron. She rotted while her screams burned out her throat. And in that rot, something else grew. A plan. She began collecting moments like weapons. The pattern of the guard's shifts. Which footsteps belonged to which cruelty. Which corridor echoed longer than the rest. She memorized the sound of Julius' voice when he passed above her cell. The faintest trace of cologne slipping down the stairs like mockery. She whispered his name into the floor until it stopped sounding human. Now the pups trembled against her chest, and the heat inside her flared hotter than ever. She curled around them, chains rattling, a shield made of a woman who had nothing left to lose. They had broken her body. They had not broken her will. Her lips moved again, barely sound, a promise meant for blood and stone alike. She didn't ask to be saved. She didn't ask for mercy. She listed what she would do. She would make Julius beg the way she never had. She would strip his power from him piece by piece, unravel his empire with the same patience he had used to erase her. She would tear the truth out into the light, so bright it would blind them all. If she lived, if these tiny, trembling lives in her arms survived. The chains didn't hurt anymore, but the fire inside her was just beginning. The dungeon vanished for a moment, swallowed by the memory that never left her. She had been running the night, the mother died, boots slipping on rain-soaked stone, the palace quiet in the way only lies can make it. A guard had whispered her name like a warning instead of a greeting. The kennels were sealed, he said. No one was allowed inside. Orders from above. Attila had gone anyway. She remembered the door not being locked, only closed. As if whoever was inside hadn't been expected to leave. The room had been too clean. No noise. No movement. The kind of silence that doesn't belong to places meant for living things. The mother lay near the back wall, her silver-gray fur dulled, her breathing shallow, eyes open but unfocused. Not sleeping. Waiting. She had tried to rise when Attila approached and couldn't. Attila hadn't understood at first. She had knelt, hands hovering, not knowing where to touch, what words were allowed when royalty was dying in secret. The mother's gaze had fixed on her, fierce even in fading, and Attila had felt it then, the urgency, the command without sound. The pups. She had followed the mother's stare to the small barred enclosure on the far side of the room. Two shapes curled together inside, barely moving, barely making noise. So small, so wrong for the weight they carried. Attila had turned back, heart slamming against her ribs, and that was when she saw it. The faint marks along the mother's side, hidden beneath fur. The way the air in the room smelled not of sickness, but of something bitter, something that did not belong in a healing place. The mother tried to speak. Not words, breath, intention, a sound that tore out of her throat and shattered in the quiet. Attila leaned closer, pressing her ear to fur that was already cooling. The message wasn't complicated. Don't let them be erased. By the time the guards arrived, the mother was still. By the time Julius followed, robes immaculate, concern rehearsed, Attila had already memorized the room. What had been moved, what had been scrubbed too carefully, what they wanted forgotten. He had looked at the body as if it were a mistake that could be corrected. You shouldn't be here, he'd said softly, like she was the one out of place. She told him everything, every detail, every suspicion. She believed that was enough. Now the pups clung to her in the dungeon, shivering against her ruined body, and the memory slammed back into her with a force that nearly drove the air from her lungs. This was what they'd killed for. Not power, not politics, silence. They had murdered a mother so quietly that the world hadn't even noticed. One of the pups whimpered, its tiny chest fluttering against hers, and something vicious twisted inside Attila. Not grief, not pity, possession. She lowered her forehead to the pup's fur, chains creaking as she tightened her hold, and she let herself imagine the shape of what came next. Julius, standing in a room that no longer belonged to him. Julius discovering that secrets rot when they're kept too long. Julius learning that some deaths don't end stories. They start them. She would not forgive. She would not heal. She would build her revenge the way they had built her ruin, patiently, invisibly, until the moment it was too late to stop. The assassins were closer now. Their shadows stretched across the floor, slicing through the light. But all Attila could see was a silver-gray mother on cold stone, eyes burning even as life slipped away, begging her without words to remember. She had remembered, and now she would make them all pay for it. Alexander always walked a step ahead of the others. It wasn't authority that put him there. It was appetite. He didn't hurry down the dungeon corridor. He didn't need to. The iron door had already been opened for him, the torches already lit. This wasn't a mission. It was a conclusion, and Alexander liked to arrive slowly at the end of things. Behind him came the rest of the squad, boots hitting stone in uneven rhythm. Moses with his blade held loose like it weighed nothing. Salome breathing too fast beneath her hood. Berenice with her jaw clenched so tight it looked painful. 4 blades. 1 prisoner. Orders stamped with Julius' seal and the Emperor's crest. Paperwork clean enough to wash blood from hands. Alexander stopped a few steps from Attila. She was on her knees, chains dragging her shoulders forward, blood pooled dark beneath her. She wasn't begging. That annoyed him more than screaming ever could. Her eyes were wrong. Not dull, not broken. Burning. Like something inside her had refused to accept the shape they'd forced on her. Then he saw the pups. For the briefest moment, his face shifted. Not pity, not hesitation. Calculation. He took in their size, the way they clung to her, the way her body had folded around them instinctively, like the chains weren't there at all. Get them off her, he said, flat as stone. One of the squad stepped forward. The pup in Attila's arms let out a sharp, frightened sound, burying its face deeper into her chest. She tightened around it, muscles screaming in protest, teeth bared without realizing she'd done it. Alexander watched her do it. You were supposed to be empty by now, he said. That's what this place is for. He gestured with 2 fingers. Moses advanced, boot grinding against the floor. The chains overhead rattled as if they were trying to warn her. Attila didn't move away. She leaned forward instead, pressing her forehead to the pup's head, whispering something so low none of them could hear it. Her lips were trembling, but not from fear. Moses reached down. Alexander was already bored. This was how it always went. Prisoner resists. Squad laughs. Blade flashes. End of story. But when Moses' fingers brushed the chain tangled around the pup's tiny paw, the animal screamed. A raw, piercing sound that tore through the dungeon like something had split open. It was small, weak, but it wasn't nothing. The second pup echoed it, shrill and desperate, scrambling higher up Attila's shoulder, claws digging in like it understood too well what was happening. The sound hit Alexander somewhere he didn't have a word for. Not guilt, not doubt, annoyance. Enough, he snapped. Moses yanked. Attila reacted before thought could catch up. Her head snapped forward, teeth sinking into Moses' wrist with everything she had left. There was no strategy in it. No grace, only fury. Moses swore, stumbling back, blood bright against the dungeon gloom. The squad froze. Alexander stared at her like she'd just broken a rule he'd never written down. You're going to make this ugly, he said quietly. She lifted her head. Blood was on her mouth. Her eyes were wild. She didn't deny it. That was when he decided she would not die quickly. He signaled the others into position, spreading them just enough that there would be no escape, no mistake, no mercy that could be mistaken for incompetence. For shadows, closing. "Take the pups," he said again. "Then we finish her." Attila didn't beg. She drew the pups closer, chains screaming overhead, her body bent not in surrender, but in refusal, so complete it felt like it could crack the dungeon itself. Alexander raised his blade. 4 blades. 1 prisoner. And for the first time since he'd started this job, he didn't feel like he was walking toward the end of something. It felt like the beginning of a war. The pups had never been meant to survive this place. They were kept in a cage barely taller than Attila's knee, shoved against the far wall where the light couldn't reach, where the guards didn't have to look at them unless they chose to. Small, shivering shapes with ribs too visible beneath soft fur, eyes too large for bodies that hadn't learned what safety felt like. They had learned fear instead. They knew the sound of boots. They knew the scrape of metal. They knew what happened when the door opened and the air changed. And when Alexander's squad stormed the dungeon, that knowledge rose in them like instinct, older than memory. The first pup hit the bars again and again, tiny body slamming into rusted iron with a force it shouldn't have had. The second circled frantically inside the cage, whining, scratching, throwing itself against the lock as if it could tear its way free by will alone. The assassins didn't notice at first. They were too busy watching Attila fold herself around the pup already clinging to her, too busy deciding which part of her they would break next. Then the cage gave. It wasn't dramatic. No explosion. Just metal that had been eaten hollow by damp and neglect finally deciding it was done. A bent hinge snapped. The door sagged open. The pup spilled out. They didn't hesitate. They didn't explore. They didn't even look back at the place that had held them. They ran straight across the stone, nails skidding uselessly, slipping in blood and straw, crying the whole way like they were tearing themselves apart to get somewhere that felt less like dying. Attila turned just in time to catch the first one against her chest. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs. She gasped, pain flaring white-hot through ribs that had never healed right, but she locked her arms around the tiny body anyway, trapping it against her heart before the assassins could even understand what had happened. The second pup didn't slow down. It launched itself into the chain at her wrist, jaws closing around the iron, tugging uselessly as if it could pull her free if it just tried hard enough. They screamed, not like animals, like children who had never learned how to make their voices small. The sound tore through the dungeon, bouncing off walls that had heard too much suffering to pretend it didn't matter. The chains overhead rattled in answer, metal answering metal like the whole place was shuddering awake. Attila bent forward, folding her broken body around them, face pressed in a fur that smelled of fear and old straw. She felt the first pup burrow deeper into her shirt, its heartbeat frantic and fast, and she whispered into the chaos. Nonsense words she didn't remember choosing, sounds meant only to keep something alive for another second. The assassins stopped, not because they cared, but because the moment wasn't clean anymore. This wasn't a prisoner on her knees. This was something feral, something clinging, something that didn't fit the neat ending Julius had ordered. Alexander recovered first. He always did. "Move," he said sharply, as if that would reset the world to where he wanted it. But the pups only screamed louder. One of the squad stepped forward again, slower this time, eyes flicking from Attila's bared teeth to the shaking bodies in her arms. He reached out. Attila grovlet. It wasn't a sound she'd ever made before. It came from so deep inside her it surprised even her, a broken, hoarse noise ripped straight from instinct. She drew back as far as the chains would allow, shielding the pups with everything she had left, her whole body screaming its refusal. The light flared through the ceiling again, cutting across her face, catching the blood on her mouth, the madness in her eyes. This wasn't just a woman about to die. This was a mother that had never been allowed to be one, kneeling in chains, daring the world to finish what it had started. The dungeon fell smaller with the pups in her arms. Their tiny bodies shook against her chest like they were trying to crawl back inside her, as if she could become a hiding place thick enough to keep blades out. Attila pressed her face into their fur, breathing them in, the sour scent of straw, the faint warmth that told her they were still alive. For a heartbeat, she forgot the men behind her, forgot the chains, forgot the fact that her body was nothing but fractures stitched together by stubbornness. Then a torch hissed closer, and the air changed. She lifted her head slowly. Dust swirled through the shafts of light cutting down from the ceiling, settling on her lashes, sticking to the dried blood on her lips. The assassins were moving again, their boots careful now, like predators circling something wounded but still capable of biting. The pups whimpered, higher, thinner, their fear threading straight through her bones. She bowed her head over them, not in surrender, but in containment, and something in her finally gave way. Not tears. Resolve. It was a quiet thing at first, a hardening behind her eyes. A line being drawn somewhere no one could see. She shifted the pups closer, one pressed beneath her chin, the other tangled in her chains, and she spoke to the dust, to the stone, to the memory of a silver-gray mother who had died alone. I will remember every face, she whispered. Her voice barely reached past her own mouth, but didn't need witnesses. Every step you take, every lie you've ever used to sleep at night. Her words weren't prayers. They were inventory. She thought of Julius, his clean hands, his soft voice when he told her to be brave. She thought of the way the court had turned its eyes away when her name was read, how silence had been easier than truth. Her mouth curved into something that wasn't a smile. You won't get away with this, she said, louder now, not to the assassins but to the dark that had swallowed her. You don't kill a mother and expect the world to stay quiet. The chains overhead rattled as she shifted, metal scraping metal, and the pups cried again, small, desperate sounds that cut deeper than any blade. Attila closed her eyes and pressed her lips to the top of the nearest trembling head. I swear, she murmured into its fur. On your lives. On the woman they buried, so no one would ask questions. On every breath they tried to take from me. She opened her eyes. The assassins were close enough now that she could see the seams in their leather, the flicker of flame in their pupils. Alexander's blade caught the light, a thin, cold line cutting across the darkness. You will choke on what you've done, she said, her voice hoarse but steady. I will pull the truth out of this place with my bare hands if I have to. And when I find the man who ordered this, when I finally look Julius in the eye again, he will understand what it means to be helpless. The first pup crawled higher, wedging its tiny body under her jaw, and she tightened around it, chains biting deeper into her wrists. She welcomed the pain. It kept her here. It kept her furious. I won't forgive, she finished. I won't forget. I will burn every lie down to the bone. The dungeon answered with silence. The assassins stepped forward, and Attila stayed exactly where she was, kneeling in blood and dust, a broken woman wrapped around two fragile lives, carrying a vow that felt heavier than the chains ever could. The blades were already lifting when the air changed. It wasn't dramatic at first, just a shift in weight like the dungeon itself had inhaled. The torches along the wall guttered, flames bending sideways as if something unseen had passed between them and the stone. Alexander noticed it. His eyes narrowed, the smallest hesitation creeping into the line of his arm. Footsteps echoed down the corridor behind them. Slow, unafraid. The assassins turned as one, blades still raised, but none of them advanced. A figure emerged from the darkness beyond the iron door. Not armored, not hooded, wrapped instead in layered cloth that whispered with every step. Her hair was bound in silver cords, her eyes dark as deep water. Nefertari. She stopped just inside the dungeon, gaze sweeping over the scene. The blood on the floor, the chains biting into Attila's wrists, the two tiny pups buried against her chest like they had grown there. Her expression didn't change, but something ancient woke behind her eyes. Lower your weapons, she said. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Alexander didn't obey. He held her stare, jaw tightening. This is not your jurisdiction. Nefertari walked closer. The chains overhead creaked as she passed beneath them, dust falling into her hair like pale ash. She stopped a few steps from Attila and knelt, the most powerful seer in the empire lowering herself into filth without a second thought. Attila flinched, instinctively curling tighter around the pups, a low sound caught in her throat. She expected interrogation, accusation, Another lie wrapped in silk. Instead, Nefertari reached out and pressed 2 fingers gently to the smallest pup's head. The dungeon went still. The pup stilled too, as if it recognized her, as if it had been waiting. Nefertari closed her eyes.
For a long moment, nothing happened. Then she inhaled sharply, like someone dragged back from deep water, and opened her eyes again. Not to the dungeon, but to something only she could see. "Blood remembers," she whispered. Attila felt it then. A strange warmth spreading from the pup into her own chest. A pulse not her own, threading through her broken ribs, settling into places pain had hollowed out. Her breath hitched, confusion cutting through the fury for the first time since the door had opened. "What are you doing?" Alexander snapped. Nefertari stood. She turned slowly to face the execution squad, her gaze hardening into something that made even Alexander take a step back. "This woman is under my protection," she said. "She is not your prisoner. She is not your casualty. She is the bearer of the bloodline." The words hit the dungeon like a dropped blade. Attila shook her head weakly, chains clinking as disbelief tried to push its way through exhaustion. "You're wrong," she said hoarsely. "I don't belong to any bloodline. I belong to this floor." Nefertari looked at her then, really looked, at the torn clothes, the blood, the rage barely contained behind sunken eyes. "You were chosen the moment you stepped into that kennel," she replied. "You were chosen when the mother gave you her last breath instead of silence. You were chosen when the heirs ran to you instead of their own kind." She gestured to the pups. They were no longer screaming. They were pressed against Attila in a way that felt settled. "The old law binds blood to blood," Nefertari continued. "But the first law binds life to will. These heirs do not cling to you out of fear. They cling to you because something in you answers what was taken from them." Alexander laughed once, sharp and humorless. "Prophecy doesn't change orders." Nefertari's eyes cut to him. "It changes empires." She turned back to Attila. "They tried to erase you. They failed. You now carry a legacy older than this dungeon, older than Julius' lies. Through you, the bloodline will endure, not in secrecy, not in cages, but in defiance." Attila swallowed, the weight of the words pressing down harder than any chain ever had. She didn't want destiny. She wanted revenge. Nefertari seemed to hear the thought. Her voice softened, just a fraction. "You don't have to forgive," she said, "but you must live." And for the first time since they dragged her into the dark, Attila felt something other than hatred rise inside her. Not hope, but inevitability. Above the dungeon, the palace still believed its own lies. Cleopatra moved through the West archives with a quiet that came from years of learning how to survive rooms built by men who expected obedience. Octavia followed, lantern held low, its light barely touching the carved pillars that had witnessed too many secrets to care anymore. The execution order had crossed Cleopatra's desk that morning. Julius' signature had been perfect, too perfect. She'd known that hand since girlhood. He didn't sign like that when he was angry. He signed like that when he was proud. Something in her had recoiled. They weren't meant to be here. The West archives had been sealed since the Wolf Queen's death, written off as a place of mourning that no one needed to revisit. But grief didn't rot hinges or erase records, and Cleopatra had learned that when men buried rooms, they were usually burying truths. Octavia slid a narrow key from her sleeve and worked it into the lock beneath a tapestry that had faded to the color of dust. The door opened with a sigh, old and resentful, and the smell inside wasn't neglect. It was chemicals. Scrolls lay scattered across a marble table, their seals broken, their edges stained where hands had been too hurried to be careful. Cleopatra lifted the nearest one and felt her breath catch. Medical notation. Dosages. Not sickness, toxins disguised as fever, written in Julius' script so familiar it made her skin crawl. They read in silence for a long time. Orders to restrict the mother's food. Orders to move her to the lower kennels for privacy. Orders to alter the nightly watch so no one unvetted would be present. There were references to a woman, the messenger, who had discovered something she was not meant to. Attila. Octavia's lantern shook. He planned it, she whispered. All of it. The mother. The prisoner. The execution. Cleopatra closed her eyes, the weight of it pressing down on her like the throne itself had leaned forward to listen. Julius hadn't acted out of desperation. He'd been laying this road for months, steering the empire one silent murder at a time. They found the final piece hidden beneath a ledger, sealed in wax the color of dry blood. Cleopatra broke it with her thumb. A directive to the dungeon. No trial. No record of transfer. Immediate disposal. By the emperor's authority, Octavia read, voice breaking. Signed, Julius. Cleopatra folded the parchment with care, as if it were fragile instead of monstrous. Somewhere beneath their feet, a woman was on her knees in chains, holding the heirs of the bloodline against her shattered body, while the man who'd engineered it all sat in council and spoke of loyalty. Cleopatra straightened, anger sharp enough to steady her hands. We take this to Leonidas, she said. Octavia shook her head. He trusts Julius. Cleopatra met her eyes. Then we make it impossible for him not to see. They didn't run. They walked back through the palace as if nothing had changed, past courtiers whispering about politics and alliances, past servants who had no idea that the truth was finally awake. Below them, in the dungeon, Attila bowed her head over the trembling pups as the light flared and the chains screamed. Above her, the lie beneath the throne had begun to crack. The moment Nefertari stepped between her and the blades, the dungeon stopped being a grave and became a classroom. Not a place of mercy, a place of awakening. Attila felt it first in the pups. Their trembling didn't stop, but it changed. It became focused, as if their terror had found a direction. They pressed closer, tiny bodies sinking to her breathing, their whimpers settling into something like listening. The assassins backed away, not because they'd grown hearts, but because something older than orders had taken the floor. Guard arrived. More torches. Voices. Confusion. The chains were loosened, not removed, a reminder that she was still not free, and she was escorted from the dungeon not as a prisoner, not as a guest, but as something unstable that no one knew how to touch. They gave her a chamber just above the kennels, a place that still smelled faintly of fur and old stone. It wasn't comfort. It was proximity. The pups were left with her. That was the first mistake the Empire made. Attila sat on the cold floor with them curled against her ribs, her wrists still marked by iron, her body a map of where power had pressed too hard. She didn't sleep. She counted. Footsteps in the hall. Which guards lingered? Which ones wouldn't meet her eyes? Which ones flinched when the pups made noise? She asked Nefertari questions that had nothing to do with prophecy. Who controlled the kennel doors? Who signed transfer orders? Which couriers were loyal to Julius? The seer answered carefully at first, then less carefully, because Attila didn't sound like a victim anymore. She sounded like someone studying a weapon. The pups began to change in ways the court healers couldn't explain. They weren't stronger, not yet, but they were alert. Their ears twitched at the sound of footsteps before Attila heard them. They growled when Julius' name was spoken. They snapped at shadows that didn't belong. They were learning what danger smelled like. So was she. She taught them in whispers, her fingers brushing their fur as if soothing them while she seeded them with awareness. That sound means food. That smell means fear. That rhythm means someone is lying. The court thought she was bonding. They didn't realize she was training. Nefertari came at dusk on the fourth day, robes trailing like quiet thunder. You're not supposed to be thinking about this yet, she said. Attila didn't look up. You named me the bearer of the bloodline, she replied. Blood remembers. That's what you said. Yes, Nefertari agreed. So does injustice. She finally lifted her gaze. There was no pleading in it, only precision. You see the future. I see the present. Tell me which guards Julius placed in the kennel rotation last winter. Nefertari hesitated. That was answer enough. The empire was a body, and Julius had positioned himself like a disease. Not in the heart, where he could be seen, but in the joints, where movement could be twisted slowly until the whole thing collapsed. Attila began building a map in her head. She knew where the food came from now, which shipments were late and which were early. which couriers bowed too deeply and which didn't bow at all. She watched Cleopatra and Octavia walk the corridors with new eyes. Not allies yet, but fractures in the wall. The pups learned the palace with her. She let them roam in small, supervised circles, always returning them before the guards noticed too much freedom. They memorized doorways. They memorized shadows. They learned which footsteps belonged to kindness and which belonged to violence. She wasn't teaching them to fight. She was teaching them to notice. One night, she took a risk. She placed one pup in the crook of her arm and whispered Julius' name. The pup stiffened. Its tiny body went rigid, ears flattening, a low sound forming that didn't belong to a creature so small. The other pup echoed it. Attila closed her eyes. Good, she whispered. They weren't meant to be warriors. They were heirs. And heirs didn't win wars with strength. They won them by becoming symbols people were willing to bleed for. She began feeding rumors into the palace the way she'd once carried messages for the throne. Only now the words weren't sealed on parchment. They were given to servants who still remembered her kindness, to guards who'd once been patched up by her steady hands and training yards, to messengers who'd never liked Julius but had never known why. Nothing overt, just questions. Why were the heirs moved so often after their mother's death? Why had the West archives been sealed? Why did Julius always arrive before news did? Cleopatra found her in the kennel chamber on the 7th day, her composure a crack away from breaking. She knelt across from Attila, eyes shining with restrained fury, and placed a folded parchment on the stone between them. The evidence. Attila didn't open it. She didn't need to. She had already planned around its existence. Leonidas won't act unless he feels cornered, Cleopatra said. He will, Attila replied. But not yet. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. Julius is careful with power. He won't fight for it. He'll protect it. We make him do the opposite. Cleopatra stared at her. Ow! Attila finally smiled, and it was not kind. We let the empire believe the heirs are no longer safe with him. Outside the chamber, the pups were playing, not like children but like scouts. One crouched behind a pillar, waiting for the other to pass before pouncing. It was clumsy. It was awkward. It was learning. Attila watched them and felt something close to satisfaction settle into her bones. They taught me how to disappear, she said softly. I'll teach them how to be impossible to ignore. The empire had built its throne on silence. She was going to teach its wolves how to bite that silence until it screamed. The first thing Attila felt when the chains were finally unlocked was not relief. It was absence. The iron had been part of her long enough that its weight lingered even after it was gone, like a phantom limb carved into memory. Her wrists were raw, swollen rings of red and purple, but she barely noticed. She was actually standing, in the corridor outside the dungeon. The pups pressed into the hollow of her arms, their tiny bodies warm and real against her skin. The guards wouldn't meet her eyes. They flanked her as if she were still dangerous, still contaminated, still something that might spread if it were touched too freely. Nefertari walked ahead, her presence splitting the corridor like a blade through cloth. Servants paused in doorways. Courtiers froze mid-whisper. No one had expected to see the woman who had vanished into the dungeon come back out. Certainly not smiling. It wasn't wide. It wasn't pretty. It barely deserved the name. It lived only at the corner of her mouth, a quiet curve that had nothing to do with happiness and everything to do with promise. The pups shifted in her arms, restless, noses twitching at the unfamiliar sense of polished stone and incense. She bent her head briefly to them, murmuring words meant only for them, the sound lost beneath the echo of her footsteps. She remembered the day Julius had watched her drag down those same halls. He hadn't followed. He never dirted his boots with places that smelled like truth. This time he was waiting. The council chamber doors were open, a calculated invitation disguised as formality. Cleopatra and Octavia stood just inside, their faces taut with the kind of restraint that only came from knowing the ground beneath you was breaking and being required to act as if it weren't. Emperor Leonidas sat at the high table, hands folded, expression carefully neutral. Julius stood at his shoulder, immaculate as ever, a hand resting lightly on the back of the emperor's chair as if he were already the one holding the throne in place. Attila walked in without bowing. The chamber reacted like a living thing, a collective inhale, a subtle shift of weight as attention bent toward her. She felt in the pups too. Their tiny bodies went rigid, ears flattening, their gazes fixing on Julius with an intensity that did not belong to creatures so young. She stopped 3 steps from the table. "Why is she here?" Julius asked smoothly. "This is a council matter." "She is the matter," Nefertari replied. Leonidas studied Attila with open curiosity now, no longer able to pretend she was invisible. "You were scheduled for execution." "Yes," Attila said. Her voice was rough and used to open air. "I remember." Julius smiled faintly. "Then you'll understand our confusion." She lifted the smallest pup slightly, just enough for its face to be seen over her arm. Its eyes were bright. Too bright. The chamber stilled again. "You ordered me to disappear because I saw what you did," Attila said, meeting Julius' gaze at last. "You killed their mother. Then you tried to bury me with her." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. Cleopatra stepped forward, parchment in hand, and placed it on the table. "We have evidence," she said quietly. "From the West Archives." Julius didn't move. He didn't reach for the document. His eyes never left Attila. "You were always emotional," he said. "It made you unreliable." She laughed. It startled the room, not because it was loud, but because it was wrong. It didn't fit the shape of her face, or the bruises mapped across her skin, or the way she held herself like someone bracing for another blow. "You taught me how to survive lies," she replied. "You just didn't expect me to outgrow them." Leonidas opened the parchment with trembling fingers. The room waited with him. Each line he read pulled another thread from the tapestry Julius had wrapped around the throne. When he reached the final seal, his hands were no longer steady. "You used my authority," he said slowly. "You ordered a death without trial." "For the stability of the realm," Julius answered. The woman was a liability. Attila shifted her weight, the pups whining softly. "So were the heirs," she said. "That didn't stop you." Silence thickened. Leonidas looked up, eyes wet, something unguarded breaking through the emperor's mask. "Is it true?" Julius hesitated. It was the first time she had ever seen him do that. The pups felt it too. One let out a low, vibrating sound that made several council members flinch. Attila's smile deepened, still not kind but sharper now. "You were careful," she said. "That's what made you sloppy. You hid the body. You altered the records. But you forgot one thing." She leaned closer, voice dropping, so that only the front of the chamber could hear her. "You forgot that blood remembers." Nefertari stepped forward. "The heirs have chosen her," she said. "Not out of fear, out of recognition. She carries what their mother lost." Leonidas closed his eyes. When he opened them again, Julius was no longer standing at his shoulder. He was standing alone. "Take him," the emperor said. Guard moved in. This time Julius did not resist. He straightened his cuffs, composure sliding back in a place like armor. As he was led away, he glanced at Attila once more. "You think you've won," he said. She met his gaze without blinking. "No," she replied softly. "I think I've begun." The doors closed behind him. The council chamber exhaled. Cleopatra reached her side, a hand hovering as if unsure whether it was allowed to touch her. "You're free," she said. Attila looked down at the pups, their small bodies finally loosening, exhaustion replacing vigilance now that the room no longer smelled like threat. "No," she said again. "I'm armed." They escorted her from the chamber with less formality than before. The corridor felt different now. Not welcoming, but altered, as if the palace had tilted a fraction towards something it could no longer avoid. She paused at the top of the stairs that led back down to the dungeon. The guards behind her shifted uneasily. No one wanted to be the one to remind her she didn't belong to that darkness anymore. Attila didn't go back. She turned instead, sunlight breaking across her face through a high window she'd never been allowed to see before. It hurt her eyes. She welcomed it. As she walked away, the pups stirred in her arms, their ears lifting, their noses catching the air of a world that had tried to erase them and failed. She wasn't forgiven. She wasn't healed. But she was leaving the dungeon alive. And for the first time since the iron had closed around her wrists, Attila smiled like someone who knew exactly how the empire was going to fall.